Okay. Hello, everyone. Yael's here today. Say hello, Yael.
Hi.
Are you Israeli?
I'm not. The name is.
I know.
The
That's
name
what I was
is.
it just hit me. I had never asked you that before. Tell us about your background.
Born in Brooklyn to
Yes.
Holocaust surviving parents from Eastern Europe, hence the name Yael.
Mm-hmm.
Most of us who are children of survivors are named for a dead parent, unless our
Mm-hmm.
parents had like 10 kids.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm named for both of my grandmothers, Ulishka, and they just took the Y and found the name Yael. And then my other grandmother was named Anna, so my middle name is actually Hannah. So I born and raised in Brooklyn and then Queens, and lived for a while in Manhattan. And just important to say that my father was in the printers union. I grew up in a blue collar home. My home was actually in a limited equity co-op
Mm-hmm.
for printers and their families. And I actually still in
Wow.
DC, I'm now living in a limited equity co-op for activists. So I haven't the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. And my parents both died. I'm an only child, and my parents were both dead by the time I was 15. And
Wow.
so sort of their experiences um,
Wow.
in the in and under the Third Reich, I mean, as part of Nazism, their experiences come as immigrants and refugees, and then in the mental health system, which was not quite as compassionate as it is now. I mean, we didn't really know anything about trauma at the time, and then their early deaths, I would say, uh, are sort of the biggest shaping factors, in my life and in all the work that I've done and so many of the decisions that I've made.
This is a lot.
Sorry.
And I'm so glad. I mean, a lot in a good way because my mind is racing with questions and curiosities around your own healing. And I know what kind of work you do, and we'll get to that. But how old were they when they died? Were they
They were
young?
both in Yeah, they were both in their late 50s. So they had me when they were in their 40s, which was quite
Yeah.
late
Yeah.
for the I was born in 1968.
And where did you go when they died? Did you just start living by yourself? What did you do?
Um, I did until child welfare got an anonymous letter and came and interviewed me. And then I lived with a friend and her family for a few months. Then I lived with uh, an older aunt of mine for about 6 months. And then I dropped out of high school and went to college a year early. They accepted me without a degree. I still don't have a high school degree. I have a master's now, and I have all these like certifications since then. Um, but yeah, I did not take the conventional path.
What was your connection to spirituality, God, health? Like, what was that like? Were they sick? And sort of, how did you feel about all that? What was
Yeah.
that like for you?
So two. They're kind of two questions, right? So
Yeah.
when I was a kid, I at first there was always a connection to religion because of the Holocaust that was sort of like negatively posited. So the fact that I had a name like Yael Hannah Flusberg in a neighborhood that was white ethnic immigrant with other immigrant communities um, mixed in, but where there was a lot of anti-Semitism,
Mm-hmm.
um, was not easy. But my parents were like, well, if you forget you're Jewish, someone will remind you. So we might as well just
Mm-hmm.
give you that name. So and then when I was in kindergarten at a public school, I had um, a teacher who did not like the three Jews in the class, and did not was just not a giving or loving or encouraging teacher to me as a 5-year-old. So then I got pulled out, even though we weren't religious at home. I got pulled out and I went to an Orthodox yeshiva from first to eighth grade. And
Wow.
so there was sort of, I'm really grateful for that time, but it
Yeah.
definitely created also this dichotomy of,
Mm.
on one hand, I knew my father's father was a Hasidic rabbi on a passenger ship, and that was how that part of the family was able to get here before the final solution began. But, I used to like eating fried shrimp at Joe's Seafood on Roosevelt Avenue. And then I would go to the school with the rabbis and have to wear long sleeve shirts or um, all this kind of stuff. So I was always very conflicted about Judaism in particular. And I didn't see it as that spiritual. And, I think that actually has to do with my later attraction to more Eastern forms of spirituality. And I kind of have since come full circle.
Yeah, me too.
Because I think the Judaism that was being taught and even practiced in the 60s and the 70s was much more of a like legalistic, let's not get ourselves in trouble. We don't have to follow the superstitious belief of our ancestors. I mean, it was really trying to be something else. And with the departure of so many Jews in the 60s and the 70s to Buddhism, to Hinduism, to mindfulness practices, to yoga, I think Judaism was sort of forced, at least in the U.S., to sort of to rediscover these much more mystical roots. And so I'm sort of happy. I also spent a year, at one point I decided I had a pediatric relationship with Judaism, childlike, and that it was necessary for me to, the word Israel actually means he who wrestles with God, right? That's what Jacob was renamed. And I was like, I need to engage in some God wrestling here, or in some like Jewish wrestling. And writing for me was, I discovered writing at about the same time I discovered meditation and yoga. And so writing for me has also always been a spiritual practice. And I decided to spend 1 year, I kind of had a very manageable goal, which was engage in some Jewish practice once a month and write a poem about it. And sometimes it was a little bit more than that, but after about a year of doing that, I had a really, I was able to revise my view of what Judaism was, and even what some of the teachings that I had been given when I was a kid was. So for me now, I would say, oh my God, thank God that I went to yeshiva, because I have at least some fluidity, some way of moving in those circles, and also some ways of connecting quite profoundly with what I was born into.
Yes.
And what my own personal legacy was. And then I can connect the dots with these other practices really from all around the world that I've been so blessed to study.
Yeah, the more that we sort of take a dive and study and investigate, the more we're so similar. And what I'm also noticing, I've had a similar sort of like return to the more mystic side of Judaism and the more spiritual side of Judaism that was not, that I did not always find in big Reform synagogues on the East Coast, which tend to be more focused about money than the new moon. One of the things I've noticed is that my love for Eastern philosophy, now I'm finding Jewish teachings and connections and spirituality that is the same as the Eastern philosophy. It's just I had compartmentalized it and separated it.
Well, you weren't given it. I mean, Reform Judaism was created in the 1800s by German Jews who wanted to be more German than Jewish. And they found the ways of the ancestors quaint. So I think that's what you were given. It's been beautiful to see within Orthodoxy. I mean, Reconstructionist renewal. I mean, I think more of the spirit of Judaism being able to come back. And And that makes everything so much richer, right?
And just like now when I teach on Friday nights once a month, and we light Shabbat candles, in the yoga studio. And if I teach on a Saturday morning in the dark, early, I've taught a few times at Center for Mind Body Medicine training, and we have a 6:30 a.m. class on Saturdays. And so I'll bring my candles and we'll chant, and then we pray, and then we give hugs and say Shabbat Shalom. And it's just very fluid because and what I've noticed is that it like pulsates through my body in a way that's so much more rich and deep than and this is not a judgment, but then like namaste, because namaste is not my specific culture and language. It's like something I was borrowing for a number of years to feel this thing that I loved and felt like home. But now I've like, kind of gone back over to like, oh, well, let me integrate the Om with the Shabbat Shalom. And then and then I'm like, oh, that feels like me.
Yeah.
And that's been really interesting, interesting.
Yeah.
And I say that like studying more has made me love being Jewish and Buddhist and a human and in nature, like all the things, rather than the separation that my very like limited viewpoint for a number of years really had. And I was the more that I was learning about yoga and studying Eastern philosophy, I'm like, oh, well, I was born Jewish, but I'm not Jewish. Like I was very angry towards it, or sort of closed, and not angry, but closed and limited. And now I find more connection. So that feels better in my body, How did you find yoga? How did you move from being 15 and being alone or on your own, I should say, not alone, to...
I mean, yoga found me. I mean, I think it was popular, right? It was sort of gaining popularity. And I mean, when I became more aware of it was in the 90s. I, found a book at a garage sale, and it happened to be an Indian woman who lived in upper Northwest DC and taught mainly to embassy wives. And it was just illustrated. I don't remember the name of the author, but I would try to do some of the poses. And then I actually kind of had two early teachers, one of whom was actually a Jewish great-grandmother at the time named Ruby Blue, who I think I found her at the Jewish Community Center at 16th Street, and she also taught at Gold's Gym. And I just loved her attitude. She couldn't do all the poses by that point, but she always had a big smile on her face, and she was just very real, not a lot of bullshit. She was in a way, but she wasn't traumatized the way the older members of my family were. So there was a generosity and a softness to her, in addition to this sort of like in your face, straightforward. So she was like a slightly improved version of some of the older women I had seen. And then I had started practicing more power yoga. I bought like all three of Brian Kest's videos because he had like cut off jeans and like long curly hair, and he would wear this like bicep bracelet, you know what I mean, the mid-arm cuff. And cool. And then a studio opened up kind of kitty corner from my house, which was later known as Inspired Yoga. And it's Kira Sadovsky, who's now in Portland, Oregon, and that's actually how I met you. I started doing work study there so I could practice as much as I want. And it kind of all fit in. At that point of my life, I'd been doing activism with immigrants, with a lot of leadership development, capacity building. I sort of went back and forth between wanting to make sure as individuals, people had all the skills and the tools that they needed to make a difference in the world. But then I also saw that it was necessary to help organizations be stronger so that the movement itself could be stronger. And I really just for myself, I had gotten into yoga and writing and then street theater and meditation and shamanism. I mean, all these different practices as a way of figuring out how to, I don't think I at the time would have been able to articulate that that I had trauma. I mean, it was really clear to me that my parents had experienced trauma and that they had died, and there was stuff that I couldn't figure out. 2020, like what they say, hindsight is 2020, and it was really clear to me that I had like all the classic symptoms of trauma as well. And I slowly kind of started working on that through really all of these practices. Yeah. And in fact, the same year, I guess I'd been practicing yoga for about 7 years when I became a yoga teacher. I decided to go through teacher training. And it was that same time that I discovered Reiki, which was the original reason why me and you were going to talk. But it's all, for me, it's also so intertwined. And I guess one other thing I do want to, that you brought up from before is I do think that a lot of these practices, whether it's, the very odd, specific kind of Buddhism known as Tibetan Buddhism, or whether it's Kabbalah, or Reiki, these previously hidden practices have all seemed to, in the past 40 years or so, emerged and come out of hiding. And we could see traces of that historically. I think Krishnamacharya, one of his ancestors, was considered, I want to say it's Krishnamacharya, I might have the details wrong, was considered crazy because he would literally stand on the rooftop and shout out the secret mantra of his clan. But generally, it's sort of like, this is secret information. Only a few people can get to mastery level to know it. And I think we're just seeing this like, no, the world needs this right now. And so it's all coming out. And they are all, I think, so related.
Yeah. And so what happened with Reiki? Did it start to become, is that what you're doing full time now? Tell us a little about how you're working now, where you're working, and then sort of that evolution from being introduced to these tools and techniques to, I really know you now as a powerful Reiki healer. So for the women who are listening, and maybe some men, but mostly women, what is Reiki? What is so powerful about it? And how is it showing up in your life?
Yeah. So Reiki, ki is chi, is prana, is life force, and Rei means universal. So we can say that Reiki is just this universal energy that animates every living being on earth. And I was introduced to it because I had a bad breakup. Often, isn't that how we get into all these practices? There's some shit that happens and we have to get through it. And I did 3 sessions with a woman named Roja Oblak over at the Butler Park Center, which is on 15th and Euclid.
Yeah, beautiful place.
Yeah. And I had a really palpable experience with energy for the first time. In my yoga practices, I couldn't feel it. And actually this guy who I had the hard breakup with, like, me and him would do things like we would clap 108 times and then massage the center of our palms and try to do all these exercises to feel the chi. And I could feel it, but it took a lot of effort. And that's also what I felt like about like Kundalini yoga or other yoga practices that are really much more focused on energy. And what I noticed is that with Reiki, I was immediately able to feel it. And so I decided to, I sort of joke, I say like, Reiki is there's many different forms of working with the energy body. And I would say almost all cultures, ancient and modern, have some ways of looking at of an energetic map of the body that's superimposed over the physical body. Whether it's like the chakras in the Indian system or the haras or the dantians, right, in the more East Asian systems. And you go through different levels in Reiki. And it's very, very simple. And the learning mainly consists of a sort of cleansing of your energy system, what we could think of as our energy vortices or the aura. Mm-hmm. So there's something you have to let go of. There's like schmutz to discharge, right? And I think of it like energetically, it's sort of like a water hose. Like if you're trying to water your garden with a hose, but you have forgotten to turn on the water, then nothing's going to flow. So sometimes we have really low levels of energy, or sometimes there's a kink in the hose, and we could think of that as blockages or stagnations, and you just kind of got to get them out of the way. So with Reiki, you sort of do that discharging, and then there's something that's very akin, we call it an attunement. Mm-hmm. You know? So you could think of it as entrainment, you know, the way that a flock of birds will fly together, or a school of fish will just like move on a hair, right? And that really also helps us hold on to a greater amount of energy. Some people would say at a higher vibration. Mm-hmm. And then once you experience that, my personal experience was that then I was able, when I was doing yoga, when I was doing my breathing practices, for example, when I was moving my body in a certain way, I could then connect with the way that my energy flow is different. Mm-hmm. And I started to also understand that my moods were related to energy, you know, so how I felt going into a yoga class and how I felt going out of a yoga class was not just about the physical exercises, although that's super beneficial, but it was about this more subtle, ingredient, which is the energy. So for me, I mean, and I have studied other forms of energy work, including polarity therapy and shamanism. What I love about Reiki is literally like a child can be taught to do it. It's not hard to do. It's super simple. It's a gateway. Mm-hmm. And then if you want to get much more specific, such as, you know, acupuncturists are, you can go for it. And so it took me about, because I like to take time and sort of practice things and chew on things. Mm-hmm. And it took me about 6 years maybe 7 years from when I first started, when I got that first session, and when I became a Reiki master teacher. Mm-hmm. And so obviously, you know, a lot can change in that process, and the process of learning and diving in, you know, one thing always informs another. So it's hard for me to say, how did Reiki change my life? Yeah, it's just that I was sort of open to using all sorts of practices to transform. Yeah. And which also meant that at some point I believed that I could transform. I mean, I had to believe in the power of redemption and transformation in order to be open to that.
Was there anything specific you notice about your own transformation of being able to include the shamanism and the Reiki and the yoga, meditation, all the practices? But I have so many, like just in my own life, in my own memories, specific examples of how I was holding anger and trauma in my body before it released versus how I look at things now. So do you have any specific examples that stick out that are useful to people?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that there was often just a very low level amount of discontent. And I couldn't really, I didn't really know why. Like it was hard for me to feel satisfaction in the moment. Mm-hmm. And I think Reiki sort of, because it's, you know, as my teacher, my Reiki teacher, Luann Jacobs, always says, it's not really about any of the techniques. It's not about like, if you hold your hand like this or like this, and you'll see this, and, like literally, right? But it's about your presence. Yeah. It's always about your presence. And so just coming back and again to like, what kind of presence do I want to bring right now? What is actually the quality of my presence right now? Okay. I think I've been much more accepting of who I am and how I show up. You know, early on, and even my yoga practice, there was this sort of a lot of, you know, just kind of new age woo-woo, which didn't go with my practical working class, Jewish, blunt wisdom, you know, and so like, oh, you just have to think positively, or just, you know, just practice gratitude. No, I mean, the thing about trauma, the thing about anger, like these are emotions that also want to be listened to and cared for. So I think really, you know, learning to, like, in a non-bullshit way, accept, like, observe how you are right now, accept how you are right now. Maybe try to scratch, like, well, what's underneath this, right? Scratch the surface. And then you could, like, as Nadia says in the very first episode of Russian Doll, like, what choices do we want to make?
Oh my God, I love her. She's amazing.
She's amazing. Also a granddaughter of Holocaust survivors in real life, and her character is on the show. I don't think I'm doing too many spoiler alerts.
Yeah.
So that, like, that was a really big thing for me, is sort of not kind of, I couldn't really connect anyway to all the spiritual bypassing, to all of the, like,
love and light.
Nice, just be, yes, everything is great.
Love and light.
Because I didn't feel like that.
Right. And it's not in your cells, and it wasn't the truth. It's not the truth of our people, right? It's not the truth of a lot of people, but I also think when you're actually seeking at that deeper level, and in our community, our online community, next month, we're doing ancestral healing from the Ayurvedic perspective, and kind of just getting to know what's out there and asking people to start doing some of this work and thinking about some of what's flowing through them. Right. And when you do this,
which might be connected to epigenetics and DNA,
of course.
And right, like what the Chinese call ancestral chi is, I think, like what you inherit, right? Yeah, I think also Reiki was, because it is about the body, and it is about putting your hands on the body and feeling, you know, what do you notice? What are you sensing? And that deeper observation also allowed me to notice, like, oh, there's very particular things happening. So I'll actually, I could think of one, like, I'll give you one example. From the time my parents died, really, I would have these, like, moments of feeling off, and I couldn't really describe them to other people, except, you know, at the time we had radios. And so I would put on, like, my favorite radio station, and the music seemed offbeat. It was as though the bass wasn't right. It was as though the percussion wasn't right. It was a little speeded up, a little slowed down. So my auditory sense was off. And that was all I could describe. And everyone was like, oh, I don't know what that is. And it was only after, you know, doing the kind of deep self-observation work through my Reiki practice, through my yoga practice, that I started to realize that it wasn't that there was something wrong with me in a general way. It was, I was having an incident. I was having an episode. And during these episodes, the sensations would include a shift in sensory input. And there would also be a shift in my own heartbeat. And the minute I was having one of these, and a friend called, and when I described to her exactly what I was feeling, which I had been incapable of ever doing, I realized that it probably could be categorized as something like a panic episode, an anxiety episode. And I have never since then had that again. There was something so powerful about my ability to observe it and name it and share it with someone who was a safe person for me, that completely healed me in that one way. I mean, many other layers of like to heal.
Did you grow up or have you had a really strong sense of intuition and guidance from the inside out for most of your life, or did you develop more of that as you tuned into some of these practices? And how do you sort of talk about that in now?
Yes. So I think I had always a very rich inner life. Mm-hmm. I had a lot of imagination when I was young. And I would say imagination is actually key to intuition, but we're not always taught that. That imagination was sometimes stymied, you know, like with other kids. I remember when I was 4, I was drawing lines in marker on the white walls of the foyer. And in my mind, I was talking to my grandmother and other beings who I'd never met in real life. All my grandparents died before I was born. And I remember thinking, they don't live here, but they don't have a home here. So these lines, they can, because they're energy beings, they could use them to enter into the walls, and the walls can be their homes. And as you can imagine, I got the crap beaten out of me for doing that. So, I mean, I think there is, you know, and it's only later on.
Did you stop doing it then because you were shamed for it?
I think so. I mean, I don't know that I would have made those connections, but as I've gotten older and as I've studied shamanism and mysticism, Kabbalah in particular, lucid dreaming, I've realized that, you know, people use the word instead of imagination, and they'll say imaginal, like the ability to conjure up images, the ability to daydream is sort of the way sometimes that I think spirit talks to you.
Yeah.
The more that you get used to observing, you know, first you go in through the gross body, through the physical body, the more concrete, the more palpable. And then what I've learned through all these practices is to become much more observant of these subtle energies. And I don't really think of it as being woo-woo. I mean, in a sense, like there's now machines that could measure the electromagnetic current of our heart up to 30 feet out. That didn't exist when I was a kid. So I think what it is that your brain and nervous system is just processing information that you can't necessarily see, but that which is palpable to it. And so, of course, the longer that the longer and the more consistently that I've done these practices, the more seemingly intuitive I've become. But I think this is just because my brain nervous system has become more skillful at seeing patterns. Much in the same way that, like, I think he's been in the news recently. I think his name is Gavin Beck, who is a consultant, a security consultant for Jeff Bezos. He wrote a book in the 90s called Fear. And he said, you have to trust your gut. It's partially your gut, but it's also that your brain is constantly taking in information, which you can't possibly process. Your mind can't process it as quickly as the brain can. So I don't necessarily do really cool tricks like other friends, like
healers and spirit guides.
Yeah, like occasionally I might be able to see a little aura. I don't really see things so much.
Do you hear things or feel them, or?
I sometimes hear things, or I just have a knowing. I might have certain sensations in my body that will, so I might ask a client questions
that are coming up that you're being guided to ask because of your system
Yeah, but
possibly magnetic.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. But I still try to engage in like healthy boundaries and like
Yeah.
non-asshole behaviors. So I try not to be like, my spirit guides are telling me that you have a messed up relationship with your mom. You know,
Right.
I try not, I mean, that's also been my training of, you know, not using my intuition in a way that is prescriptive, because I don't think that that's, you know, I want to help activate the healing mechanism in whoever it is I'm working with.
That they already have. You're not giving it to them. You're not this all powerful being guru who has the answers. They have it within them. Right.
And we see what happens whenever anyone is in charge.
Right. No, I don't want to have sex with all those guys. Thank you very much.
Exactly. So instead I try to like ask questions.
Yeah. It's a more feminine approach to it as well.
Yeah, that's true. I think true. Yeah.
And I have been using, because science is proving so much of what we've been studying in our traditions in so many ways, which is awesome, because you can be a believer because of experience, or you can now read all the research. And so that's great, is that I've been saying wow, wow, instead of woo woo, because I'm like, it's just awesome. It's a wow. We don't have to now be derogatory towards our own practices that are being proved and that are alive in the world. Like, it's awesome. It's amazing that we know this and we can change all the neural pathways and networks, especially if we come from long lines of suffering and pain and trauma. And that's interesting. And who knows what we'll know in another 10, 20 years. Like, that's what's so cool about watching this level of conversation and consciousness expand into the mainstream is like, wow. And letting feminine come right along for the ride, all the unknown, all the creative possibility, you know, making space for dreaming.
And the connection. I mean, I think that's just one way, like you can describe, for example, Reiki. It's just about connecting.
Yeah.
You know.
Is Reiki going through something like yoga where it's having a lot of attention and heyday? So there's a lot of trainings by people who are not practicing and having their own integrity. Does it have the same level?
I don't think so. I don't think so. But I mean, I think Reiki was maybe more popular a few years ago than it is now.
Yeah.
You know, I think Reiki, like yoga, but for different reasons. You know, people who teach Reiki often will create their own school of Reiki. And the reason for that is that, you know, once you've learned something from your teacher and the way that you practice it is different.
Yeah, right.
Because maybe you have different interests or
your lens,
different ways of learning. And so originally, out of respect for your teacher, you wouldn't call what you were teaching what they taught. So often, you know, so there's a whole variety, and people have come up, you know, there's like Egyptian Reiki with much more Egyptian focus symbology, because there are also these like sacred symbols in Reiki and different ways of working with the energy body. Yes, I think, you know, there's no, unlike yoga now, which now has like a national certifying body, right? Yoga Alliance, or if you're a yoga therapist, the International Association of Yoga Therapists. There's Reiki associations, but there's not quite the same certification body nationally or internationally.
So who's it good for? Someone's listening and they're like, okay, that sounds interesting. Is that for me?
Yeah, I think that Reiki is amazing if your goal is stress reduction, if there's pain in the body. I mean, I always think that Reiki is good before and after surgery, before and after childbirth, to maybe, you know, if you have a chronic condition or an autoimmune condition and you really want to strengthen your nervous system to be of help, because really stress is a key component of almost every single chronic condition and autoimmune disease that I can think of. Right?
Yeah.
Will it, you know, will it cure I would say no. You know, I make a distinction between healing and curing. So for me, healing is a little bit more like reconciliation. It's coming into relationship with what is. It's maybe accepting it a little bit more, being calm about it, and being able to so you can heal into your death. A cure is you get rid of whatever the condition is, and I have had incredible experiences of my clients being cured. But I don't know if that's the Reiki. I don't know. I think that probably just jumpstarts something in their own system. Almost no one just does Reiki, and I would be a shitty practitioner if I said just do Reiki. But can it be helpful? Yeah. Like when I went through a breast cancer diagnosis 3 years ago, and did I get lots of Reiki? Yes. Anyone who offered it to me, I said yes to. Was it helpful in helping me figure out where there were, traumatized pieces of me that were very old that I needed to heal? Were there aspects of myself that I needed to forgive? Were there relationships with other people that I needed to forgive? All of that kind of stuff. I think Reiki really helped me every single day figure out, what do I need today in order to heal?
Yeah, I love that. And that's like the guiding, one of my Ayurvedic teachers, she's like, if all you ever take from Ayurveda is to know that you just wake up and ask yourself, what do I need today?
It's brilliant.
Like it will change your life, mother yourself, parent yourself. One of the things that we have in common is I think we're both multi-passionate. So what does your week look like? How are you working with people now? And what are the different ways that you work with people?
Oh, yeah, you had asked me that before.
Where can people either in DC or beyond find you or work with you or read your writing or all of that?
Yeah, I've been not so good at my blog writing because normally, so you can always go to my website, which is just www.yaelflusberg.com. So
I'll link it in the show notes.
Yeah, link it in the show. So that's one place. And then I'm constantly sort of tweaking what I'm offering. I think, going through my Reiki master's training, and then I did a clinical fellowship in Reiki at GW, where I was on the palliative care team at GW Hospital, and I was doing Reiki inpatient as well as outpatient at the GW Center for Integrative Medicine. What was so helpful, I'm still affiliated with the GW Center for Integrative Medicine, and that's a place where if people want to work with me one-on-one, they can. But it was so helpful for me too, because it helped inform like, if I could do Reiki on people in clinical settings, like this is what I want to do in yoga too. I didn't want to be limited to like gyms and yoga studios. And so I'm also I've since become a yoga therapist, which is an additional 800 hours of training. And so really all my offerings, whether it's individual sessions or classes, and I offer retreats as well that people can come to, both local and international. And then I lead mainly for other yoga teachers, yin yoga teacher training, which is yin yoga is a style of yoga that's a little bit more meditative, and it's focused on the tissues that surround the meridian. So I believe it is a practice that's especially good when you want to work with the energetic body. And I really incorporate a lot of what I've learned, by being a Reiki therapist and a yoga therapist into those practices. I am doing, in some ways, because I think more people now know what yoga is, and because yoga therapy involves not just the physical body, but the energetic body and the psycho-spiritual body. It's sort of easier for me to put everything under that umbrella. Or we could say mind body work. And that's essentially I'm working 100%, in that sea, which has been just such a beautiful way of going back to how can I help individuals transform? How can we help build community? And how could we kind of impact change in a broader way?
Yeah. Sort of one, even one by one, right? Because of that.
Or class by class by class.
Right.
Like every single time I finish I finish a 50-hour yin yoga teacher training, I know that those students are taking out an anatomy-informed approach, a trauma-informed approach, an energetic informed approach in teaching their yoga to the world. And I think we need more people with that integrative vision. And, not just to look at ourselves as machines.
Robots. Yeah. That's what I say. Yep. There was one final question I was going to ask you, and it just slipped my mind. I guess how I want to sort of wrap up is just, I want to honor you for the work that you do and how you're doing it and doing it every day, not giving up, especially here in ground zero these days. Living in Washington feels a little like...
Here is where people need the work. I mean, we have so many cultural creatives, we have so many people who are all about social justice.
Oh, that's what I was going to ask you.
Social change.
Activism. Yeah. What's your activism work look like now? Is it separate from the trainings and the yoga therapy, or are there specific organizations you're working with that you want people listening to know about, or work that's happening? Let's rise up some other...
Yeah, I mean, well, my activism is much more limited than it used to be, simply because I have other kinds of family responsibilities. I think my activism was probably at its peak in my 20s and my 30s. And it gets a little harder as you get older. I am the board chair of an organization called Antidote, which takes a public health approach to essentially to extremism, and really tries not to, and that extremism can be people in cults, people in gangs, white nationalism, I would argue. I mean, people have talked about the word cult-like when discussing the current political situation, and sort of really figuring out from a neuroscience perspective what happens to people, what makes people so vulnerable to dangerous manipulation. And in that way, I see it as being really related to all the trauma work that I've been so interested in personally and community-wide. So, I would say that that's like one of my main forms of activism right now, and then continuing to do activism within the yoga circle. Just trying to change that.
Which needs a lot as well. All of our circles need our love and light.
Absolutely.
At that real level, not at the let's bypass it and pretend it's not happening level. What was there anything, I'm just curious, anything that you found from the science, from the habits and patterns of some of the extremism for joining groups? Have there been any? Well, are their ACEs scores all really high or something like that?
Yeah, no, we haven't gone into that level of research, so I can't tell you. That would be the next step.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? What makes people so vulnerable? And that's a question that we've been asking in trauma too. Yeah. Why is it that you can have two siblings exposed to the same thing? Yeah. With really different resiliency. Yeah. Capacities. Yeah. And I do think that you could teach resilience. I mean, the other thing to remember is that your brain doesn't stop developing until about the age of 25. And I think so many people that get caught up, and we could look at these two young women, one from Alabama and one from the UK, who were basically war brides, right, of ISIL, and who both want to return, respectively to the US and to the UK. And they're about 24 now. I mean, I think that there's a lot of stuff that happens to us when we're young that we're not, and maybe we're incapable of seeing a thing for what it is and projecting out into the future, right? To have that kind of presence and awareness until we're a little bit older.
Yeah. What does your daily practice look like? Do you have daily rituals or practices that really help you?
Yeah, I do a gratitude journal every single morning. I've done that for about 9 years. And that is sort of like my hunting the good stuff as a Professor Seligman calls it. So it also includes highlights of the day, acknowledgments, things I didn't completely fuck up. I do some form of movement every day, and I also have like chronic back issues. So lately that movement has been more PT than stretching and sort of the more yoga stuff. I think it's really important to be out in nature every day and to be connected. I think we do have, nature generated ADD, computer generated ADD. So I really try very, very hard to get offline, to get disconnected from technology in order to kind of connect back to what matters. Yeah.
I love it. Eric, one of my
writing. I would say like
write every day.
Journaling is so important. And if you could, in whatever way, free writing, like for me, and I teach, I teach a weekly mindfulness and writing class, because I just think that sometimes the insights that you have in there, I mean, for some of us, sitting still is just not going to happen. But if you're focused on doing one pose for 5 minutes or writing without thinking for 10 minutes, like these things to me are all really mindfulness practice. Yeah. And you were bad. I'm sorry I interrupted you.
No, I was just going to say that Eric Schiffman, one of my yoga teachers. Have you ever taken anything with Eric?
I wish.
Oh gosh, he's so
he
delicious.
was also like an early, I remember the Ally McDraw.
Oh, totally.
Totally had that video, VHS.
And then he did a bunch of stuff in his backyard, which he like put together. He's just so adorable and real. But one of the things that he always teaches is like, you got to unplug to get the download. Like that's how he always says it, is like, go get the master download, go upgrade the system, get your software update. Like he uses all the technology language, but he means get away from it because you already have it. And he says it like that because he's a surfer dude who looks like Dumbledore, so like.
But I think that's totally true.
It's totally true. I mean, that's like, he's like, it's right here. It's trying to teach us something, but you can't do it with the thing. Like he's just always go get your downloads and get away from the computer.
I love it.
Okay, Yael, thank you for all that you do in the world and all the people that you're helping. I want to come to that mindfulness and writing class, so you'll have to give me the details. Where is it and when is it?
It's Thursdays from 1 to 1:35 at Recharge, which is a mindfulness and power napping studio. I teach a yoga nidra class right before that. Oh, and I do the mindfulness and the writing.
Okay, well, I'm adding that to my schedule. That will be awesome to come to.
It'll be great to see you in person.
Yes, I know. In real life, my favorite. Thank you, Miss Yael. Take care of yourself. Have a beautiful day. Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom. Bye.
Bye, honey.